Reginald Freeman is the 37th Fire Chief and Emergency Management Director for the City of Hartford. Chief Freeman previously served as the International Fire Chief for the Lockheed Martin and as a civilian fire chief in Iraq for the U.S. Department of Defense from 2004 to 2008. In his career, he has worked as a firefighter, emergency medical technician, fire captain, fire service instructor, assistant fire chief, and fire chief. He is an adjunct professor for Anna Maria College and the University of Florida, where he lectures in both undergraduate and graduate fire science and Master of Public Administration programs. Chief Freeman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, John. And good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at in the world, to everyone. On behalf of our Honorable Mayor, Luke Ronan, greetings from beautiful, sunny New England. Now, I'm going to share my screen because we have a lot to discuss. And although we in the fire service are focused predominantly on public safety, the roles that you and your team members are very critical as well. And something that has worked extremely beneficial for us here in the city of Hartford is practicing servant leadership. Now, the title of this presentation is Building Sustainable Success, the Resurgence of a Proud Fire Department Using Servant Leadership Principles. Now, this proud fire department has an historical element that is really not rivaled by any other municipality. For those who have not heard of Hartford, Connecticut, you may have heard of the circus fire that occurred on July 6, 1944, 76 years ago, where unfortunately 167 people lost their lives. Tragic. Or you may have heard of the Hartford Hospital fire, which occurred on December 8, 1961, where 16 people perished. Now, the fire department and the role it has played in the capital city of our state has been instrumental to the growth, success, and sustainability of the state of Connecticut. Our fire department was founded in 1790 after our state house burned to the ground. And we became an incorporated professional career fire department on December 6, 1864, after the Colts Firearm Building had burned. And just a few other facts about our organization. We are a 357-member fire department, 4 different shifts, 24 hours on and 72 hours off. That's right. Our men and women work every 4th day. I wish they had that schedule when I first started in the fire service 20 years ago. And our men and women, they do an outstanding job with great resources. However, our firehouses, the average age of each house, all 11, is 76 years old, compared to the national average of being 44 years old. So you can get an idea of the environment that our firefighters have to work with. Those old firehouses coupled with traditions, historical elements, and top-notch tools and equipment. So you take the history of our organization and you think about the grandiose accomplishments that the men and women who've worn this uniform dating back hundreds of years have accomplished, and you think about where we've been in recent time. We've had a lot of triumph, but we've certainly had our challenges as well, particularly in the last 10 years. I was fortunate and blessed enough on February 1st, 2016, at 37 years old, to be sworn in as the 37th fire chief for our capital city. However, there were a few bumps in the road. Prior to my swearing in, we had some significant systemic issues that needed to be addressed from the top office here to the 3rd floor at fire headquarters down to every single firehouse. And some of these issues, as you can see here on the current slide, included an officer reporting safety issues which were never addressed. Subsequently, we also had our first line of duty death in over 40 years when Kevin Lamont Bell died on October 7th, 2014. To this day, I still speak with his widow, Miss Wyatt, and his family. We also had a firefighter shot several times and alleged drug deal gone bad. We had a firefighter arrested while on duty at the firehouse by federal agents because he allegedly was selling narcotics. And the list goes on, as you can see. And so when you think about, wow, Chief, how is it that a storied legacy fire department, such as the city of Hartford, how did it get that bad? Why were there as many issues as there were with some of the members of the department? What contributed to this total dysfunction? And here's a few things after conversations with men and women of the team. And you heard Mr. O'Leary speak about this just briefly in our last presentation. Communication. There wasn't adequate communication from the top of the organization. That was a contributing factor to the dysfunction. There was a lack of guidance. Leadership, from the perception of some, was not there. Accountability was lacking. Members of the organization, members of the team did not feel empowered. They didn't feel like it was theirs. And on the far left, you can see structure, organization, and discipline were all lacking. And in my swearing in, the first promise that I made to our firefighters, our community, and our mayor is that we would bring back structure, organization, and discipline to the Hartford Fire Department. And I call that laying the side. Laying the foundation for the future success of our organization. And so first, before you can make any changes, and it doesn't matter that we're talking about the Hartford Fire Department, this is also applicable within your respective organizations, you have to first have an understanding of what the problems are. And you start by looking and addressing the culture. And before we start talking about culture, we have to start having a discussion about climate. It doesn't matter what organization you represent, how large or how small, before we address culture and have a discussion about that, we have to talk about the climate. And the climate, in lay terms, is defined as events that occur to individuals in real time that have an impact on their attitude, that have an impact on the attitude of the overall team, their quote unquote job satisfaction, which contributes to their self-actualization or the lack of their self-actualization. It can be anything that generates an emotional response. We are all feeling that right now with COVID-19. If you look at the culture of your team pre-coronavirus, and you look at the culture of your organization right now, it's not necessarily that the culture has changed, the climate has changed. And we as leadership, we have to ensure that we address that. So transitioning to culture, we've taken a look at the climate within our respective organization. We have asked for input and feedback from those members of the team who actually do the work and do the job. And so now we can start addressing some behavioral norms. And so culture, a lot of times we look at culture defined as norms, beliefs, and values. But typically, what happens is that not addressing problems before they become a crisis is a reinforcement of negative behaviors. If you don't address problems before they get out of control, that now becomes your cultural norm. And it's going to be a lot harder to address those problems later on down the road. Positive reinforcement, however, for good behavior brings forth the institutionalization of the behaviors that you want within an organization, which are those positive team building, team oriented elements of each member. So let's take a look at what we did within the first 4 days. As I mentioned before, the Hartford Fire Department, we have 4 particular tours. Every member of the organization is assigned to one of these tours, out of our, at the time, 12 fire stations and 357 firefighters, it was very, very important to me to touch base and see everyone my first 4 days in the office. And that wasn't by happen chance that occurred. I intentionally wanted to show every member of the team that they cared, that I cared, that they were valued, and no matter how difficult it was for me, how early in the morning I started or how late I was out in the firehouses talking to them, that it was important enough for me for them to see me and I see them. And so as I talked about expectations, I finished every single meeting asking every firefighter, every group in every firehouse, now you've heard what your expectations are from me. What are your expectations that you have in my regard? And the theme was consistent. There were 3 constant things that came up in every single conversation. And the first was, Chief, we want more accountability for members of this department. People are getting away with doing things, violating policies, and there are different standards for different people. So number 1 was accountability. Second, Chief, we don't train enough. We don't have enough opportunity for different training elements that are critically important for us executing our duties and responsibilities and us meeting the mission. So Chief, we need more training. That's our second expectation of you. And last but not least, Chief, we want to be able to wear our fire department t-shirt in the grocery store off duty and not be embarrassed. We want to have pride within our organization again. And that's critical. That's very important to any team, whether you're a public servant or working in any setting, is being able to have pride in not only what you do, but pride in the rest of your team and your organization. And there's only one way to accomplish all of those things. And that was to truly embrace the elements of servant leadership. Now, my undergraduate degree, my BA, is in leadership. I have a Master of Science in Executive Fire Service Leadership, and I'm currently pursuing my doctorate in organizational leadership with an emphasis in organizational development. So I've been a student for quite some time, and I will continue to study any and everything having to do with people, leadership, and processes. And out of all of my studies, one leadership style, quote unquote, if you will, that's really stood out to me, that's been very, very effective in my business, because you cannot be a public servant without being passionate about people and without being passionate about service. And I think you can't be an effective leader without being passionate about people or passionate about service. But servant leadership consistently stood out as something that was critically important. And it was established by Robert K. Greenleaf in 1970 from a faith-based Christian philosophy that he implemented or wrote about within his essay back in 1970. And the tenet of the philosophy is the CEO works for every member of the organization. It's not necessarily that every employee works for the CEO. So think about that for a second. Traditionally, even though there's thousands of documented leadership styles out there, there's 3 that's more commonly talked about and discussed, and that's laissez-faire, democratic, and autocratic. So imagine taking an autocratic person in a position of authority and now asking them to have a mindset that their job is now to serve those who work for them. But what I say is, in today's workforce, with 4 different generations in the workforce, with 4 different thought process and personality traits and characteristics, you all have seen all of the scales and all of the graphs and the charts that talk about Generation X values this, baby boomers value that. You think about the different generations in the workplace and their priorities, and how are you going to effectively lead and manage them? And one common mistake that we make is giving persons in positions of authority the title of leader. or the title of manager for that matter as well, but particularly giving someone that's in a position of authority the title of leader. Me as the 37th Fire Chief and Emergency Management Director for the City of Hartford, I am in a legitimate position of authority granted by the city charter appointed by our strong mayor. My actions, however, dictate if I'm a leader, especially an effective leader. And so instead of just looking at persons in positions of authority and calling them leaders or referencing them as managers, I want you to look at it from three different perspectives. You have a person in a position of authority, then you have leaders, and you have managers. And our goal as persons in positions of authority should be to eventually become and sustain being a managerial leader. You have to know when to manage, and you have to know when to lead. And servant leadership really helps us do that. There's 10 particular traits that contribute to someone being an effective servant leader. And we're going to go through those 10 traits: empathy, listening, healing, awareness, persuasion, conceptualization, foresight, stewardship, commitment to growth of people, and last but not least, building community. And the mindset that we all have to have as it pertains to servant leadership is that it's not about me, it's about we. It's about the team. We succeed and we fail together. If we are not coaching and mentoring on a daily basis, we're not doing our jobs. And we can utilize these critical principles to make a difference. All right, so let's get down to it. Listening. Listening is an important trait of a servant leader because you have to make a deep commitment to listening intently to others. And for some of you on the call, you've heard of the term either passive listening or active listening. Servant leaders, or any effective leader for that matter, certainly does not passively listen to people. You have to be engaged actively, which means that if you are at your desk, and I have to do this on a daily basis, if someone comes into your office to have an important conversation, we have to push back from that desk, direct our bodies towards them, synthesize their statement that they are making or the question that they are asking so that they know that we value what they're saying and that we are paying attention. So we have to practice active listening and not passive listening. Don't just be looking at your computer screen or typing, not even looking at your team member when they come in and have a conversation, because that is, of course, not active listening. Being empathetic. People need to be accepted and they also need to be recognized. There was a study by Harvard University 12 years ago for Fortune 50 companies that asked employees, what would you rather have? A 2% raise or your supervisor regularly coming by your workplace, asking how you are and telling you you're doing a good job? And yes, you guessed it. The response was overwhelmingly the latter. They'd rather have their supervisor or manager reinforce their hard work and their contributions to the organizations rather than just get a 2% raise with no interaction at all from leadership. So we have to make sure that we are recognizing our employees and being empathetic to what's going on with them, not only professionally, but also personally. Third, healing. So it's very important that although a lot of different things are going to happen in the workplace, and some people shy away from conflict, there is a such thing as healthy conflict. We have crucial conversations and critical confrontations. And sometimes that healthy conflict has to occur in order for there to be progression. So it's our job, again, as not only just those persons in positions of authority, but effective servant leaders to mediate and facilitate that healthy conflict. Because it's very critical and very important for not only one to heal, but for the overall organization to heal and move on. Next, awareness. And awareness helps one in understanding the issues involving ethics, power, and values. We are all going through trying times. It's very difficult, even for my 357 trained professionals in the Hartford Fire Department, in the beginning, when we first in Hartford were given the task of responding to a quote unquote COVID-19 presumptive call. Now we have EMTs, we have people that are trained to medical first responder, we have a few firefighters that are paramedics, but this is different. This is a global pandemic, something that our country has not faced since 1918. So there is this general sense of insecurity because it's the unknown. And as long as we as leadership understand that we have to give consistent direction and communication to every member of the team so that they have that security, we're going to have a much, much, much more effective workplace and workforce. Next is persuasion. Reliance on persuasion rather than on one's position of authority. It does not matter what the bugles or the stars of my collar represent. I don't have to go to a firehouse or have a conversation with someone and announce myself as Chief Freeman. Everyone knows who the fire chief is. Just like within your respective organization, everyone knows who the managing partner is. Everyone knows who the operations manager is. Everyone knows who the CFO is. If we have to lead with our title, we don't truly have exceptional followership. Think about that for a second. If we have to remind people of who we are in a conversation or state what our title is, that's not true followership. And if you don't have true followership, you will never, ever be able to exercise effective leadership. Conceptualization. Look at a problem or an organization from a conceptualizing perspective means that one must think beyond the day-to-day realities and the day-to-day happenings. So it's not just important what's happening today or next week, but we also have to look at the impact of what's going on for the next quarter, for the next fiscal year, whatever that may be, and down the road. We have to plan accordingly, which we're going to talk about here momentarily in a few more slides. So don't just focus on what's happening today. Also make sure that your team and the members of your organization are prepared for tomorrow, which speaks to foresight. Knowing and understanding what's happening today has an impact on what's going to occur in the future. And that typically, foresight is typically synonymous with experience. Now, a lot of us, when we have a conversation about competency or someone who's competent, we automatically say that Jane, who's been with the company for 26 years, is the most competent person to exercise that task. It's not necessarily that Jane has been doing that job or been with the organization for 26 years that makes her competent. It's a combination of her training, her education, and her experience, but most importantly, the application of Jane's training, education, and experience is what makes her the most competent. So keep that in mind. Next, stewardship. Servant leadership, like stewardship, assumes, first and foremost, a commitment to serving the needs of others. I take great pride in every time I visit with any one of my firefighters, starting a conversation off with, how are you and how's the family doing? First and foremost, doesn't matter what business we are going to be talking about. How are you and how's the family doing? And then we have our conversation, and it always ends with, is there anything that I can do for you to make your job easier? I do that intentionally because I want every member of the organization to know that I care first and foremost about them as individuals. And then secondly, I want them to be successful. Next, the commitment to the growth of people. And we talked briefly earlier about one of the many requests from members of the organization was additional training. I have members of my team that at the time had been with the department for 22 years and had never heard of the National Fire Academy. I had one senior officer when I was having an officers meeting and I was talking about industry best practices and how we can take what we're doing in Hartford and that can eventually become an industry best practice, but we also need to embrace industry best practices. And this officer raised his hand and said, Chief, what do you mean when you say industry best practices? I don't understand what you're saying. So obviously, the commitment to the growth of every member of this team was critically important to our future success, and especially with me being the fire chief and emergency management director for our 357 members. Critically important is my commitment to their growth and my commitment to their development. And last but not least, the 10th trait of a servant leader is building community. Although we enjoy the reputation and the accolades of our citizens and local and state and federal elected officials at the Hartford Fire Department, our mission is to serve to save. Doesn't matter if it is a life or if it is property, but we can't do it alone. We need to convince any and everyone, all stakeholders, that their fire department is properly executing their duties and responsibilities, that we're mission focused and goal oriented, and that takes the entire community for us to partner with in order for that to become a realization. So with all that being said, with us practicing servant leadership at the great, storied, and legacy Hartford Fire Department, there's a lot of things that have changed within the last 4 years. We've seen a budget increase by 7%, and that is directly correlated or tied to the productivity of the members of the team and us being able to track data and submit those data sets to decision makers to show that we are doing everything that we're supposed to be doing. Feedback and input from the actual men and women who get the job done has certainly increased, and people aren't scared to provide their feedback and their input. We have an established professional development program that was done in partnership with labor. The job is a lot safer because the firefighters have the personal protective equipment and the equipment to clean their personal protective equipment to protect them from dangerous carcinogens, which are currently plaguing the fire service. And so one thing that I try to talk about as often as possible is the 5 Ps. And the 5 Ps is proper preparation prevents poor performance. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about changing the climate and the culture of an organization or getting through this global pandemic that has impacted everyone in this country, such as COVID-19. Now, as I mentioned before, we have highly trained men and women in the Hartford Fire Department. And the only reason why we have enjoyed these successes that we have thus far dealing with or mitigating COVID-19 is that we had been adequately prepared to mitigate any emergency, but we just had to adjust or pivot, as Mr. O'Leary had mentioned earlier, in regards to our mission. And so once we were able to secure all of the personal protective equipment that we had to secure, we were able to write and draft new policies and procedures that are going to help keep our members safe. We were able to just review and revise documents accordingly, policies accordingly, and we have enjoyed the fruits of those labors. And you obviously are doing the same thing in your environment. Are things different today? Absolutely, they are different today. But trust me when I tell you that you are prepared. Get feedback and input from members of the team, the men and women who are directly involved with the success of your organization, and get their feedback. So what you're looking at now, the picture on the left is a portion of my backyard when we first bought our house 3 years ago. So I mentioned to you, I was sworn in February 1st, 2016. I came up to Hartford, Connecticut from Fort Worth, Texas, and I'm a yard guy. Unapologetically, I'm a yard guy. Not necessarily a green thumb, but a nice gas grill or charcoal grill and green grass, that makes my day, coupled with a few other things that I won't mention. And the pic on the right, that is my yard today. So I literally put blood, sweat, and tears into this yard. And I'll be honest with you, I was tempted to just have it sodded, but I fixed it the old-fashioned way. And that old-fashioned way was with time and hard work. So I tell you this story because no matter how bad something may appear or seem, get the facts before you react. Take a deep breath, relax, and start the quote-unquote storming process of analyzing your options. From those options, you need to comprise plan A, plan B, and plan C. But also, as you're well aware, in some instances, you may have to go through the entire alphabet, and that's okay. We call that the forming phase. The key is to have a strategy in the event of what you came up with just plain didn't work. Once your plan is implemented, continually assess progress. Your plan should include the anticipation of possible impediments and strategy to overcome them. Once that is done, enjoy the fruits of your labor. And that is the last and final stage of the planning process. We call that norming. And you need to enjoy it because you've earned it. So the moral of the story is where we start doesn't dictate where or how we will finish. When you properly analyze a problem, be patient and give 100% to something. The grass will always be greener on the other side. So in closing, servant leadership is critical to the success of the 21st century person in position of authority. As I mentioned before, we have different generations in the workplace, and the things that we did before, especially in the environment that we are in pertaining to COVID-19, the things that we did before may not be what we are going to be able to do in the future. We're going to have to adjust, and we're going to have to recalibrate. And being able to lead a diverse workforce and individuals from diverse backgrounds, that's definitely challenging. But if you can understand and implement the tenets of servant leadership, and you can effectively communicate, and that communication goes down just as well as it should also be welcome to come up, you can accomplish your goals. So ladies and gentlemen, lead with confidence, lead with integrity, and lead with passion. I'll be more than happy to take any questions, and if there aren't any, I want to thank you for the greatest gift you can give me, which is your time.
Thank you, Chief Freeman. You have an amazing perspective on leadership, and we are very appreciative you were able to share it with us today. And thank you for your leadership and service. Thank you for all participating in NAFA Leadership Day. Hope we are all inspired to embrace our roles as leaders. As you've heard throughout the past few hours, we need leaders more now than ever. People with leadership skills who others look to for guidance and reassurance. People like insurance and financial professionals are the ones who are going to get us through the COVID-19 crisis.